Hi, I'm Rebecca Cantrell, the New York Times bestselling author of The Order of the Sanguines and Joe Tesla series. I'm here talking with J.F.Penn, New York Times bestselling author of the arcane thrillers. And I first came across her work when I read a novella of hers called One Day in Budapest. And I just fell in love with your style and the worlds that you create, where you have this intelligent historian who can also go out and kick butt while she's solving these mysteries and traveling around the world. And it very much reminded me of the series that I co-write with James Rollins, the Order of the Sanguine series. And I think that those readers would definitely love your work as well. And your latest book is called The Gates of Hell, which is kind of funny because the latest Sanguines book, Blood Infernal, wraps up at the Gates of Hell. So what drew you to take your character straight to hell?
Oh, well, first of all, thanks for having me today, Becky, and I love your books too, and it's so great to connect with you like this. And it is also hilarious, don't you think, that we're both writing about the gates of hell, and we didn't know, did we? We didn't know until until I put out my book, and you were like, "Oh, hey, our book's about that too." Which is kind of funny. But for me, what happened? What's so weird, actually, just the other day I found a diary from 2004, and we're recording this in 2015, right? So I found this, and I wasn't even writing at the time. I was writing journals. So I found a journal when I had traveled to Granada and Cordoba and these places in Spain. And I'd actually written in those notes the phrase, the gates of hell, from the Bible. Oh. Yeah, so I found this, and I didn't have any idea that that it had been that long in gestation, and I found this in my diary. But the Gates of Hell is sort of it's book 6 in my Arcane series, which is, sort of religious, supernatural thriller. And I started off by getting into Spanish Kabbalah, which is the Jewish mysticism. And I started getting into Jewish demonology and discovered the devourers of God, which I love as a phrase. It's awesome.
Yeah, that is a wonderful concept.
It is, and as I started to research Kabbalah and Spain and started to use the Granada stuff, and Morgan Sierra, my character, is half Spanish Jew, half British Christian, so that kind of brings in her history. And so, well, obviously I won't go into the end of the Gates of Hell, though it's probably quite, we have to get there, don't we, at some point. But I think for me, I love the phrase. I think it's a really evocative phrase, and so I loved it as a title. But the book is really mainly about, that Jewish mysticism and the different places. So Safed in Israel. It opens at the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, which you probably know. You travel a lot, don't you?
I haven't been there, but I've seen pictures online. I would love to go.
Oh, it's stunning, and I went there with my husband, and I just, it is jaw dropping. It's just the most amazing modern cathedral you would ever see, and it's kind of like Tolkien as well, because it's very natural. Gaudi didn't believe in straight lines, so it's all different shapes inside. The pillars are like trees, so I really desperately had to have my opening scene at the Sagrada Familia, and so that kind of sparked the book, really. And so what about you and James Rollins? Where did your Gates of Hell come from?
Well, our novel series is also set in the Catholic world, and it's the idea that there are vampire priests that we call sanguinists that subsist on the blood of Christ. So we were looking a lot into biblical history and trying to figure out where that would end up. And I think we knew pretty early on, even before we were done with the first book, that eventually we were going to end up at the gates of hell, and we were going to have to deal with what that meant. And so we spent, over 1,000 pages kind of getting to the gates of hell. And I know for some people it's easy, right? One little sin, straight to hell. But some of us have to write like 1,500 pages to get to hell. But it was really fascinating to study the mythology and the religious beliefs that are underpinning it. And we tried to kind of tie things back to that wherever we could, to work inside of that kind of rich world. And you're a theologian, right? You actually have a degree in theology. So I'm a hell amateur, but you're like a hell professional. So did that help? I mean, because obviously the gates of hell were haunting you for 11 years. And did your theological background help you doing the research and help you to prepare for it, or not?
Yeah, it's funny. So I do have a master's in theology from Oxford. I mean, it's actually one of the oldest degrees in the world, which isn't, sounds really amazing, but it does mean that the syllabus is still about 1,000 years old.
Oh, wow.
So as in, I was studying the Bible in Greek, that Israel before the exile and Israel after the exile, and early church patristics and all this type of stuff. So, and amazingly, it does underpin so much of our culture. And, of course, you're in Germany, I'm in London, our architecture, symbolism. You walk around Western countries and you see the stuff out of this, tradition, mythology, belief, whatever you want to call it. So I think what I find in my writing is, even though when I left theology, I became a management consultant before I moved into writing, the ideas were planted for so much of my writing back then, because I studied it, because I love this history so much. It's so fascinating. So, for example, the Pentecost, the first in the Arcane series, is about when Jesus rose from the dead. The stone of the tomb was broken into these pendants that the apostles wore, and then got passed down over time. Obviously, that I made that bit up.
I was like, oh, that's so cool. I want a Jesus stone necklace.
Yeah, exactly. So, but then the stones are kind of, you have to find them by going around and finding the bodies of the apostles. So this is early church martyrdom, and, where are the bones of the apostles? And of course, as you know, they are around the world in churches. Yeah. So you can go visit the bones of the apostles. So why not have stones from the tomb of Christ? So the idea of the where are the apostles' bones are from the original early church patristics that I studied, early church fathers, and I visited a lot of the places. Probably 90% of what I write about I visited. So I know, and I love bringing my travels into everything. So really, for me, it's funny. Theology is an academic study of religion, and I think I carry on that study as you do, and then what we do is we kind of twist it, don't we? I mean, for example, you use the Sanguine's transubstantiation. Do you want to explain that for people who might not know?
Oh, sure. So in the Catholic religion, there is a belief that during Mass, the wine is transubstantiated and actually becomes the actual body and blood of Christ. So what you are drinking is not wine, what you're eating is not a wafer, what you are drinking is the blood of Christ, and what you're eating is the body of Christ. And this was a huge point of contention during the Reformation, because the Protestants didn't believe that. They thought it was a metaphor. And many, many people, were killed over the belief that either this is the blood of Christ or this isn't. So these were things that people were willing to kill and die for. And so the idea is, from the books, is that the reason that was created was because they were bringing a group of strigoi, which is vampires, into the Catholic Church, and the way for them to subsist would be on the blood of Christ. So to let them be able to live without sinning. But of course, it isn't that simple. There's a cost for that. There's a price for that. And when they drink the blood of Christ, they're not as strong. They don't heal as fast, and it's very painful for them because they are damned creatures. Their soul was taken from them when they became strigoi, and they can't ever necessarily get that back. So there's the idea that they have this when they're inside of this tradition, but it isn't simple. Because I think one of the things that vampires had kind of moved away from with Twilight and a lot of other newer vampires was this idea that I thought, and James thought as well, that it should have a cost. So if you look at some vampiric traditions, the older ones, it's not all fun and games. There are real consequences to being a vampire. Whereas if you look at some of the more modern ones, I mean, for example, Twilight, they can't go out in the sun because they're so beautiful, which is the opposite of, they can't go out in the sun because it burns them. Yeah. And so if you look at the Cullen vampires, for example, there's no cost. They don't have to kill people because they can subsist on animal blood. They can go out whenever they want, and they're eternally youthful. So there's no inherent conflict to their nature. And one of the things that we were working from was the idea of bringing that back to the foreground.
And actually, there's a new movie out, Dracula Untold. Have you heard of this yet?
I have heard of it. It's not coming out here for quite some time.
Yeah.
But I definitely, when I hear it, yeah, it's supposed to be the background behind Dracula.
And it's about that cost. It's about, I guess Vlad, we don't want to go to the historical Vlad because it's quite horrible, but in the movie, it's like in order to save his people, he must give up his life and his soul for his people. So, and I find that I've only watched the trailer, I haven't watched it yet, but it's like I'm so much more compelled to read when there is a cost. And I think for both your books with James and my books, and in fact your historical series as well, we know that there is always a cost. And I mean, both of us have body count in our, action scenes, fighting, and a lot of dying. And, I think that's a really important part of writing thrillers. I think one of the big things we tackle, good and evil, life and death. I mean, would you say those are the themes of your work as well?
Well, yeah, I think good and evil, life and death, light and darkness, this idea that in the real world, things are more complicated, and there is a cost to anything you do. And even if you're doing things with the best of intentions in the best possible way you can, there's still going to be a cost. Mm-hmm. So I have like the Hannah Fogel mysteries that are set right before and during World War II. And it's a time where, she can't really ever win. The Nazis are going to come to power. World War II is going to start. And she doesn't necessarily know the future, but she knows that Germany's headed down a very dark path. And all she can do is kind of light the little bit and try to do good in the small world that she is in. And I think that life is more like that than the pure kind of easy light ones. And those are more real to me. Those are more real conflicts where real people struggle with real problems and have to make compromises.
And I like, but again, both of us write, particularly this sort of action-packed, fast-paced, certainly the Sanguines as well, fast-paced books and my books too. So you can read them at one level as the action thriller, but then you can, I hope, read them at another level and get some kind of message out of them. And also, one of the things I love about writing is finding cool stuff to actually include. So, for example, in Gates of Hell, Gematria is it's basically Jewish numerology. So every, and numerology and Torah letters all each have a number. So Gematria is like your name would have in Hebrew would have a number, and then there are a whole load of other words that have the same number. So it's really important that names and words, can mean other words. So what was so brilliant in the book was I had to find places in the world with the right gematria to fit the clues as I was doing it. And I don't know if you find this too, but the synchronicity that often happens when you're actually researching stuff. You have an idea, you think, I would like to write about this, but because it needs to be rooted in fact, I need to go find something real. And then you find something real. Do you get that too?
Yeah, I'm always amazed at how once you have an idea of how something should be and you start looking for information to back it up, it's just there. So, we had the vampires and then we also have angels, and there's angelic forces in the second and third book. And so we wanted to start from the tradition of alchemy. And so we were researching alchemy and we stumbled across John Dee and Edward Kelly, and they were real historical characters that existed in medieval England. And also they traveled to Prague, which is where they are in the story. And these were men. John Dee in particular was a scientist and a mathematician. And he wrote a lot of mathematical theories that are still used today in mathematics, but he was also interested in the occult, and he believed that he could talk to angels. And so there was this guy, Edward Kelly, who allegedly, or at least John Dee believed that Edward Kelly could talk to angels if he looked at this mirror that was made out of black obsidian and had come from the New World. And he could see the angels in there, and they spoke in this strange language called Enochian, and they transcribed this language, and it also was numerical based. And through that, then he could use his math to understand the language of the angels, and that was this man's true goal in life. Mm. And that was all very real. And Jim and I had talked about, bringing all this stuff in, and then I just stumbled right on this real historical character who had done every single thing that we would have needed him to do for the book hundreds of years before we needed it. It was very strange.
Yeah.
And that happens again and again.
And it's funny you say that, because of course that mirror is in the British Museum, which
I know,
which is my research ground. And one in my London Psychic series, Blake works at the British Museum in order that I can use all this stuff. And again, and we just have the same brain, right? Because my next book, One Day in New York, has Enochian on a artifact in the New York Met.
Wow. Yeah, we have a bunch of Enochian passages in
we do. I mean, maybe this is just the field we work in. It's like we're so fascinated by the same type of stuff. Anything with a religious or kind of that arcane kind of edge, we're immediately drawn to, like, little bees.
Although it is odd how we stumble across the same things. And I think that any writers do that, because there's all this historical mystery. And then when you start looking at it, you have this kind of same brain where you're like, oh, that is cool. That there's something there. That's very, very cool. And then you go down the same kind of paths. And then you end up in different places because
exactly.
We
end
writers.
Up using the same ideas for different plots and different characters. And that's why people like both types of books, right?
Yeah. And then I think for the John Dee book, for example, when I was researching that, we wanted to open, and we do open, an alchemy laboratory. And I had we'd researched that online, and I had found a painting of an alchemist lab that was painted at around the same time as the book. So we wrote it with that, and I used a lot of details from that. And then I went to Prague, and there was an alchemy museum. So in Prague, there's a place called the Speculum Alchemy Museum. And it turns out that in the 1500s, Prague was the center of alchemy for Europe, and there was an alchemist court by the castle, and then there was a secret tunnel that led under the river to this other small part of town, the Jewish section, and there was an alchemist lab underground there that nobody knew about, but Rabbi Liu, very famous alchemist, worked there. They blocked it up in the 1600s. Nobody knew it existed, and then in 2008, there was a flood in Prague. The street collapsed. There was this giant hole. They followed the hole down, and they found this alchemy museum completely intact that had been there for 500 years. And so I got to go to Prague and tour it, and they cleaned out all the mud and all the river, and you could see like the original big giant flasks where they'd used for distilling things. You could see the room where they had tried to make the Philosopher's Stone. You could see their furnaces, and they actually had a glass bottle that contained the elixir of eternal youth, brewed by Rabbi Liu himself, that he had stuck in the wall behind this
I hope you're going to say you drank it.
No, but they wouldn't let me drink, but they did let me hold it.
Wow.
I pulled out the novelist card. I'm like, I'm a novelist and I'm writing a book, and they said, here you go. And I'm like, oh, what if I drop it? What if I drop the 600-year-old elixir of eternal youth? And Rabbi Liu had also left in Latin directions for how to brew it. And you can buy it online through the museum website. And there's a group of monks in Brno in the Czech Republic that brew the elixir of eternal youth. And it has like 170 different herbs, and they have to be collected at moonlight at certain phases of the moon. It's an incredibly complex thing.
That's amazing. Well, you'll like this then. My Gates of Hell has a golem in it.
Oh, how cool!
Yeah, same guy, right? Rabbi.
Same guy, Rabbi. Yeah. In fact, at that museum, there was a bookcase. And the bookcase slides across, and you go down the steps to the Alchemy Museum. And we're walking down, and there's this big iron ring in the wall. And I said, what is that for? And I was assuming it was something like dogs or whatever. And the woman looks at me, and she's like, that's where Rabbi Liu used to chain up the golem. And then she just walks right down the stairs. And my husband and my son are following her, and I was just sitting there staring at that iron ring, completely transfixed by the idea. So when he was bad, apparently, Rabbi Liu would chain him at the top of the stairs, and he would have to sit there at the top of the stairs, I guess on like golem timeout.
Yeah. And then he got a bit out of control, didn't he? So he had to kind of melt him down. But no, that's cool. And this is what's so fun about talking to you. You don't meet many people who get so excited about the same things that we do. We're just like, hey, look at this cool place. And I think we're very lucky to live in Europe too, because I mean, we could write about every square mile of where we live, right?
Because everything is here. There's so much history here to write about. And yeah, it is really cool talking to people who get excited about this stuff. Once I wrote a book, and it was a vampire book called I, Dracula. And a friend of mine who's a medical examiner for Manhattan wrote me an autopsy for the vampire's victim. And it was an official autopsy, with all of the language and all of the everything. And I got it as I was at Starbucks one morning. And so I'm in line with my husband, and he's ordering whatever. And I'm like, oh my God, my autopsy's here. Dead silence in the entire restaurant. And I'm like, look at that. It says the spleen is unusually pale. And my husband's like, honey, can we talk about this outside?
Yeah, or when we're walking around London and I'm like, that would make a great murder weapon.
Yeah, that makes people nervous. Yeah.
It does.
You're going to kill someone here. How would you do it? So what is the coolest kind of research that you did for the Gates of Hell? Like something that was completely unexpected. For me, it would have been that museum in Prague. Did you stumble across something like that? Not counting the Sagrada Debris.
Yeah, I think probably. Well, I'm a scuba diver, so I'm actually a dive master. So I've done a lot of scuba diving. I love scuba diving, and of course, all thriller characters can scuba dive because they're action. And for the Gates of Hell, I ended up again. This is one of those funny things. One of the Gemsatria. And I was finding the clues as I was going through. So I'm in Safed in Israel, which is the center of Kabbalah, and I need from there. And I was kind of stuck. I was like, how do I get from here to the Gates of Hell? Because if you do your research as you have, the Gates of Hell are not in Safed. There are a number of places in the world where they could be, but they're not there. So I was like, I'm rattling, how do I get here? Anyway, I did some gematria on the various things I was doing, and I found, I don't want to give too much away, but anyway, I end up at the Dead Sea.
And that's so salty. You must have had to have a lot of weight.
Well, exactly. So what I wanted to do was go look for Sodom and Gomorrah, and
as one does.
And of course, if you actually do they have done various research, and there are some people who say that the remains of Sodom and Gomorrah are at the bottom of the Dead Sea, and there's actually the hills of Sodom around there, around that area, the southern part of the Dead Sea. So then I was like, oh well, I really want to scuba dive on the remains of Sodom and Gomorrah. And then I found that you can actually scuba dive in the Dead Sea. And I found a video on YouTube of diving down there. Now, I wouldn't recommend it to anyone because it's so salty that if you have to wear a full face mask rather than just, a reg and stuff. If you get that water in your throat, you immediately asphyxiate. So, because it's so salty, you will die immediately. So, and you have to, like you say, you have to wear massive amounts of weight. So it's very dangerous and only, extreme sort of diving. And also, it's really not a great dive because there's not much down there. It's not like the Red Sea with loads of fish. So I think it was pretty amazing to find a video of scuba diving under the Dead Sea in the salt. I mean, that's awesome. I mean, do you do a lot of research on YouTube?
I do. I do because there's so much there now. When I was writing, for example, for the Hannah Fogel books, where you wouldn't think there would be much stuff, I was amazed to find just all kinds of people's vacation video from 1936 would be up on YouTube. Or, there was like a little commercial that the Germans filmed and that they ran in Britain, which was like 7 minutes about why people should come to the Berlin Olympics in 1936. And it was in color film. So it was the first kind of color film I'd seen from 1936. It was fascinating because the cars, I guess because I've seen some of the black and white movies, I assume that cars back in the day were black, white, and gray. But in fact, when you look at them, they were like, canary yellow and, baby blue and bright red and all this. The whole kind of world became much more vibrant. And when I saw that, then I could make the cars look like that. And then for the Joe Tesla series, which is set in the subways underneath New York, there are a whole bunch of urban explorers who go down in the subways under New York. They sneak in through various manholes and off of the platforms, and they film it. So they go to the deserted stations, and they go down steam tunnels, and they crawl around sewers, and all of that stuff is on YouTube. So you can go all these places and if they catch you, I imagine you get arrested or fined or something, that, I would not necessarily want to spend, 2 or 3 hours crawling through a sewer in New York, but I'm totally happy to watch somebody do it on YouTube.
I think we watched the same movies because in my one day in New York, I needed to get from one place to another. So I did the same, thing. It's like, go into the tunnels, and there's that, is it Undercity? It's called Undercity. A guy who does this stuff.
Yeah, there's a guy who sneaks in. You can buy a tour with him, and then he'll sneak you into various places. Yeah, that's the same guy.
Yeah, it's really cool.
And so, yeah, it's amazing what is available on YouTube. And that makes such a difference because, there are places that I won't necessarily ever get. I will probably never crawl around the sewer under New York City, although I would love to go see the abandoned stations. Like City Hall Station is a station. It's a beautiful, decorated station that only ran for, 40 years. And then it was closed down because the tracks had a bend and the newer trains couldn't use them at the full speed or something like that. But that's on YouTube, and I would love to walk around and see that. And London has a bunch of stations like that as well.
Yeah, and in fact, this is another similar theme. Like my book Prophecy, it's all about catacombs. The Paris bone catacombs, the Palermo, the mummies. The Capuchin crypt in Palermo with all the mummies, and a lot. I think both of us do tend to, like you said about the Prague. A lot of us tend to go underground. And I don't know whether there's something, there's always something scarier. Like in Paris, there's something like, what is it, 10 million bodies or something? It's utterly crazy. And then they've piled all up the bones, and you walk around, and it's not creepy at all. It's actually not creepy. It's just kind of smells like the earth. And but I love that. And you're fine with me saying I love catacombs.
Yeah, no, it's definitely true. I know when I was writing with Jim, the first book, there was so much underground stuff, and they're climbing through tunnels, and I'm doing all this tunnel stuff. And so I'm like, for the second book, I've decided we'll have a new theme. We're going to call it the water book, and the third book will be the air book, and everybody's going to be outside. We're going to go outside. So he's like, okay, we can do that. And then as soon as I wrapped up the book, I started my own series, the Joe Tesla book, which is set entirely in the tunnels underneath New York City. And Jim has not stopped giving me grief about it ever since then. He uses every opportunity to point out that I was I told him we couldn't live in the tunnels all the time. And then the very next thing I did was set up a whole tunnel book. But there is something to be said, and I'll give him credit for that too. There is something to be said for the things that are hidden underground, the things that we can't see. Mm-hmm. And those are places where you can go and see those things. And anything could be under there. I mean, if you dig deep enough under Paris or Berlin or any old city in Europe, you could find amazing secrets.
Oh yeah, we like finding those, and of course, both of us are attracted to archaeologists, and certainly for me, Morgan Sierra is kind of a female Indiana Jones / Lara Croft kind of figure, and finding these ancient things are part of our brand, I think, sort of interesting. Of course, you're a historian. I would say your Hannah Vogel books are based in a different time.
Yeah, real life. Yeah, for those books, I didn't go off the rails so much. So the Hannah Vogel books are very historically accurate. And if I do deviate from the real historical world, then I say so in my author notes where I deviated and why. Yeah. Whereas obviously the Strigoi books.
And another question I've been pondering about fantasy. Whether the books are fantasy. So I know mine is The Gates of Hell, and there are, like I mentioned, a golem. There's various supernatural elements. I mean, you have the Strigoi, who are vampire priests, whatever. We're thriller writers, and a lot of the stuff we write is based on fact. Like probably 90% of what I write is fact, and then I just twist it. And I think that's the same for you and Jim, certainly. So how do you ever call yourself a fantasy writer or dark fantasy? I'm starting to call myself a bit like dark fantasy as well as thriller.
No, but we do call them gothic thrillers, which I think brings in the idea of the supernatural gothic world.
Yeah.
Because for me, I feel like fantasy books are not at all based in reality. So those are things like Lord of the Rings that are based in a completely different reality than the one we have. Whereas my book does have some overlap. I mean, I know we don't have the vampires and we don't have werewolves.
The vampires aren't real, Becky.
Oh man. But I do think that there's more overlap. Whereas in the pure fantasy things for me are like Lord of the Rings or the Chronicles of Narnia, where you go into a world that really isn't like the ideal. I could be completely wrong. And now you also write another series that's both more and less reality based, I would say, the London Psychic series. You want to tell me about those? I've read one. I really loved it.
Oh, thank you. Well, I think what happened was, again, doing research or just, experiencing London, I went to the Hunterian Museum, which is a medical specimen museum in the London College of Surgeons. And
we have one of those here too. Yeah. The Charité Museum, same thing.
Yeah, and they have them, all over the world. And when you actually walk around it, there are babies in jars, there are bits of bodies in jars, there are diseased limbs, there are some very disturbing things in jars. And though also the thing that disturbed me most was the early dissection boards. So they actually had a wooden board and they had dissected away everything but the veins of the person. And being a thriller writer, as I'm sure this happens to you, I thought the person was alive. I just thought, what if that was a murder? What if that was a murder? We don't know that. This is like a 17th century teaching device. I mean, we do know that, like Burke and Hare in Edinburgh, we know that people were murdered to give to the doctors, the early doctors, the resurrectionists, went and dug up bodies, but there's also evidence that they killed people. Well,
I mean, if there's enough money, then of course people have done it.
Yeah, so they'll do that. So anyway, I went to this medical specimen museum and I was really viscerally, like my stomach was clenching. I was disturbed by this place. Now, when you get a physical reaction to a place, to me, that means I have to write about it. Like this has to go in a book. So of course, you have to visit this place, right? It's got these massive glass cabinets, multi-shelved, all with these bottles. It's amazing. And then right in the middle is this kind of open space. So of course I had to open the book with a body in the Hunterian. So then it was a question of, well, what, and then who is the body and what happens next? And I had originally wanted to write just a straight crime novel, but I've discovered that I can't write anything that doesn't have a supernatural element. So what I ended up having was a character from the British Museum round the corner, Blake, who's half Swedish, half Nigerian. So he's a mixed race character, which is very common in London. And Berlin, obviously, it's kind of mixed race. And he's a psychic and he reads objects. So when he picks up an object, he can read the history. And this book, Desecration, then goes into the history of the anatomists and people like Mengele at Auschwitz, kind of ties into that experimentation that we've done on both live bodies and dead bodies. And then I got into body modification and, the things people are doing to themselves when they're alive.
On purpose.
Yeah, on purpose, like splitting tongues and, implants. And then there's another there's an exhibition in New York called the Bodies Exhibition, which is plastinated corpses. Yeah. You may not go a bit far. But it's amazing because you're actually seeing and they're kind of dissected and you can see inside and it's an amazing technology. But all of these things came together and it's a murder mystery series with a British detective and a psychic kind of sidekick and a bit of romantic tension. But so there's it's got a standard murder mystery level, but then it's also got this kind of deeper level of all the interesting stuff that I find in London. So the second book, Delirium, so the first one's Desecration, which is the physical body. Delirium is about madness and it opens with a murder in Bedlam, the historical Bedlam, and goes into the history of madness in London. And then I'm just about to start the third one, which is going to be Deviance, which of course is the sexual history of London. So that's going to be really fascinating, I think. And I've just started reading. And of course, London being so densely rich with interesting history, there's just endless amounts of cool stuff to put into it. And so I'm really looking forward to doing the research on this.
So I think that's the ability to find cool stuff for me is one of my favorite parts about being a writer. Is I get to, for a living, find things that I think are cool and then put them together with crazy voices in my head and write it down. And that's my job. So for me, and it lets me go all these places and learn all these things that are, for me, absolutely fascinating. And I think that, for me, is the best part of being a writer. Now, what about for you? What's your favorite part about being a writer?
I think it's probably the same thing. And I think you and I both share this need. I think it's a need to actually go to places because, there are writers who do all their research on the internet. But I love, doing this, like we went to Budapest. When I wrote One Day in Budapest, we spent 4 days. My husband said, this is very romantic, when I took him to the torture museum and then the mass grave at the synagogue, There's something, but then we went shooting in a bunker, in a Soviet bunker, which he really enjoyed. But I love the immediacy, like you, the immediacy of actually going somewhere, and you find things that you probably wouldn't find if you were just researching. And maybe it doesn't impact the story that much, but it adds that flavor for us, that kind of experience. And no, I mean, I do think there's a color that comes from actually visiting the place, like this opening scene at the Sagrada Familia. I think, my own reactions to the things that I saw there, the things that I picked out in the church to kind of use as my scene, those are from my kind of personal experiences. Plus, I can share my photos, or with my audience, and I do a Pinterest board for every book. So people can go and look on Pinterest and see all the things that went into the book, which is really cool. So I think we're quite similar in that way. We like doing these travels.
It is fascinating, and there's something about the sense memory. I mean, there's something about actually holding the elixir of eternal life in your hands and knowing that it was actually in a glass case. There was the glass elixir inside a glass case, but still, I was this close to something that was brewed and touched by Rabbi Liu, who was a famous alchemist who created, allegedly, the golem. And to think that I'm holding that is just a wonderful, powerful connection to history. And I think that, that's one of the best parts about it.
I think maybe, at some point we should organize some kind of travel trip for people who want to come with us to these cool places.
People who want to go and see the supernatural and be terrified. Well, I mean, there are tours like that. There's the Ripper Tours of London, which I didn't go on because I was traveling with my younger son. But I definitely think there's an appetite for that. So people did want to go on this Ripper Tour of London, where you went to the places where Jack the Ripper had been and learned historical facts about those events. And there's Golem Tours of Prague, of course. And
oh yeah, I mean, it's great. And actually, I've been to Israel like 11 times. So a lot of that comes into my books. I in the Arcane series, I think 6 out of 7 have some kind of Israel scene in. But it's funny, I haven't actually been for a while. It's been a long time, and I'm actually, my husband's Jewish and he's never been. So I'm like, I really need to get back to Israel and kind of, see how it's changed. And one of the places that I really want to write about there is Megiddo, which of course is the historical.
That's where Armageddon happens.
Armageddon. And it's and now it's they've done an archaeological dig. It's like 13 cities that have been razed. That's why it's Armageddon. Wow. because it's right in the center of the gold, the golden thingy crescent that was, everybody came through Megiddo, so it just got destroyed over and over again. So it's an amazing place, and I definitely want to write something there.
So is that your next research trip?
Oh goodness. Well, I'm speaking in America, in Charleston. I'm going down to Savannah, in Georgia, and I feel like I will be writing something about Savannah because I first read about it in The Garden of Good and Evil. Did you?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil.
Yeah. Years ago, like 15 years maybe, that book has been out, and since then Savannah has always had this kind of romantic image in my head. So I definitely think there's going to be something that comes out of Savannah.
Good.
And what about you? What's your next book?
Well, I don't know. Oh, my next book is Joe Tesla 2, The Tesla Legacy, and that's coming out February 5th. So it's coming out 5 days before Blood Infernal, and some kind of weird serendipitous
thing,
scheduling conflict thing. And that one is set in the tunnels underneath New York City, and that was a lot of fun because it opens up with a scene of Nikola Tesla. And so I was able to do a lot of research about him. He's such a fascinating historical character. So he's a scientist who worked at Edison's lab, invented a whole bunch of stuff, including alternating current, which is why we have electricity today. And but was also very, very odd. So he never married. He couldn't touch human hair. He was obsessed with the number 3. So whenever he ate dinner, it had to be in multiples of 3. And he had to chew a certain number of times. And he had to have 18 napkins and like all of these kind of things. And the only creature that he was ever, according to him, romantically in love with was a pigeon.
Oh dear.
And yet he was this brilliant man who really set the stage for a lot of the modern world. And so you have this kind of interesting character, and I can't believe there has not been a Hollywood movie about him yet. He's shown up,
I think there is
side movies and he's in TV stuff, but there's never been has there been a real? I've seen documentaries, but I've never seen like a big Hollywood Nikola Tesla movie. He was had like a little bit in The Prestige.
Yeah, I was going to say The Prestige is the one that comes to mind.
But he's only in there for a few minutes.
But his technology is kind of the center of that plot.
Yeah, well, I mean, and the idea of, ball lightning and being able to just hold lightning in his hands, and he did. And he, shot lightning miles. We still can't do what he did. And so this book opens up with the earthquake machine, which is a machine that allegedly he invented, that when you set it to the resonance, so it vibrates at the same frequency as an object, it can destroy that object. So he said that he could knock down the Empire State Building with 5 pounds of air pressure. And that if resonance were applied at the proper parts of Earth, he could split the Earth in 2. And so this was in, like the New York Times and in the 30s and all this other stuff. And he allegedly created this device and created an earthquake in Manhattan, and the police came, and that is such a great Nikola Tesla moment. So there's an earthquake in Manhattan that he's created with his device, and the police immediately come to his lab, because if there's some crazy thing going on, that's where you go.
And again, that's really funny, because I just interviewed Scott Mariani. Do you know Scott's books?
Mm-hmm.
His latest book is about the Tesla machine.
Oh, is it?
Yeah. So it's so,
it's in the air.
We've all got the same minds, haven't we? We're just so fascinated with similar stuff. It's awesome.
I think there's stuff that's in the air, and there's certain moments where it comes down, and everybody who's thinking along those lines has their moment to interact with it. So that's the next one. The Tesla Legacy comes out February 5th, 2015. How about you? What's next for you?
Gates of Hell only just came out, so I'm quite happy with that. One Day in New York will be the next book that comes out, and that's there's something buried under New York, basically, that keeps New York from being destroyed. So that's kind of the hook on that one. There's a secret underneath. So we get into that. And then the next one will be Deviants in the London Psychic series. So, yeah, and again, I was just thinking of the underground thing, because I'm also, I also want to get under Edinburgh. Have you done under Edinburgh?
No, I haven't.
Oh, there's some serious ghost tours under Edinburgh, because, of course, there were places that were bricked up and people were just left to die with the plague. And, there's some really horrible stuff under Edinburgh. So I'd actually really like to write something up there. So I'm thinking of, and this is the other thing, we've got to remember to research more locally, rather than always going, yes, I must get to Israel and in like Iran. I really would love to do a trip to Iran, because there's some amazing stuff in Iran historically, but a little more difficult to travel there. It's just, but in my, I'm in London, but also Edinburgh's only up the road. So I think I'm going to try and do a bit more local stuff as well as the far off lands.
See, I seem to fail at that. I wrote all my Berlin books before I moved here. And now that I'm here, I haven't written a single book set in Berlin. So I apparently cannot do local research.
You're right, because of course, and now Joe Tesla's in New York.
Joe Tesla's in New York, and I'm in Berlin. So I think I have to move to New York to write stuff set in Berlin. I wrote the first Berlin books when I was in Hawaii, so you never know. And there's a lot of fascinating stuff there as well.
Oh, I think everywhere, once you actually get into it. Because, I mean, well, you mentioned that I want to write one in New Zealand. I was in New Zealand over Christmas, and there's a lot of Maori gods around the volcanoes and, you know, the Polynesian volcanic gods. And I'm thinking, well, what happens if there's a big, you know, volcanic eruption in New Zealand and these gods emerge, you know, from the island, kind of take their island back? And I'm like, okay, but that's an entirely different thing.
Well,
so many ideas, don't we? I mean, this is our life. It's very exciting.
It is a lot of fun. So many ideas, but not quite enough time.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, that would be fast. And New Zealand is so beautiful and so diverse, and there's just so much going on there. So I have one more question, and that is, I hate this question, so don't give it back to me. But I get this almost every time I do an interview. Who is your favorite author?
Well, it's a very tough one. I mean, I would say probably my favorite book is The Stand by Stephen King.
Oh.
It is, to me, it's my gold standard of good versus evil, you know, light versus dark, the kind of epic struggle, the supernatural angle. It probably could, you know, is considered post-apocalyptic because, you know, it's after a plague. But to me, that's not what I remember. Like, I don't remember it as a post-apocalyptic book. I remember it as this kind of good versus evil and this, you know, evil character. And so that's kind of my gold standard and the book that I come back to over and over again, and my aim is to write something that's as memorable as The Stand. And the fact that I think they're going to try and make it into a movie again, like many of King's books, they've not made good movies of, or have failed, but they're going to try again with The Stand, which makes me think that, you know, there is this desire for more supernatural things that, you know, both you and I write. So that's good. And then I've got to add, because this is, you know, I think I told you this, the reason I started following you is because you co-wrote with James Rollins, who is one of my favorite authors, and probably one of the reasons I write the Arcane series. So the Arcane is a secret agency under Trafalgar Square in London, and it's a series, you know, and because of the Sigma series, I was like, I want to do what James Rollins does, which is have an organization where I can have a whole series that will keep going, you know, that I don't have to come up with new characters. I just have to put them in a different situation. So the Sigma series is kind of my model for Arcane. And also I used to love reading, well, I still love reading Rollins, but when before I started writing, he and you, because I have the hardbacks, the only author I buy in hardback.
Wow.
So I have your book, you know, yours and James's book in hardback. So, and you know, totally faffing up to stalking you because you were co-writing. But then, of course, I discovered your other books. And this is so much the world, I think, you know, you discover authors because of authors you already know. So, you know, and then I discovered you and Joe Tesla, which is award-winning as well as best-selling, you know, amazing. So there you go. And if I'm not allowed to throw that back at you, the question I'm throwing back at you is, show us those gloves and what is on those gloves.
Oh, these my sister made me these. These are my Bam Pow. So I've got a Bam Pow, and she knitted them for me for Christmas, because when I write in cafes in Berlin, they don't heat them adequately, and so I'm usually there, and I have on my sweatshirt and my sweater and all my stuff, and my hands get cold. So these don't have any fingers, and I can type with them. So they're my Bam Pows. And then when I get mad or I'm writing an action scene, I just I'm like, oh, Bam Pow, and for some reason I find that endlessly amusing.
Tell your sister that there is a market for those gloves.
The thing is, she only knits a few and then she gets bored.
Well,
so you have to catch her early on before she's done with them. I think I got a blue pair, and then I got a green, and one is green and one is red last 2 Christmases ago. And I've been begging for them, and it took her like 2 years to finally do these for me. So I can tell her, but I know, aren't they cool?
They're amazing.
And they keep your hands warm, and they're just wonderful. Pow, pow. So where can we find you and your books online?
So my books are ebook, print book, and audiobook. They're available on all the online stores, Amazon and Nook and all the usual places, and also at jfpenn.com. And you?
Well, my books are also available everywhere that fine books are sold. So they're in bookstores and Amazon and Kobo and iBooks and all those places. And then my website is RebeccaCantrell.com. And on there, I don't sell my books, but I have information about the background of the books. I occasionally do blog posts about research trips or the story behind the story of what I've been working on. Well, thank you for talking to me today. This was wonderful. I had a great time.
Yeah, it was super fun. Thanks so much, Becky.